Okay, class, so I welcome you back to another important lecture, and today we begin with this entirely new phenomenon that we have got with our body, and this is entitled as the homeostasis, we say. And if we were to clearly see that what this homeostasis actually mean, so you see that the maintenance that we bring about for the internal constant environment that we have on the inside of the body, and that would be the homeostasis with us. And by the internal constant environment, what we have to be making sure is that the conditions within the tissue fluid and the conditions within the blood plasma, they have to be kept constant. Like if I were to talk about us, the human beings, so we have this external environment to deal with, and then we also have got this internal environment to deal with. And no matter the external environment or the internal environment, the conditions they keep on changing. And if I were to talk about the conditions that makes a part of the internal environment, so there is this factor or the condition of the temperature and the water level and the waste materials and the pH and the stuff like that. So when I would try to be maintaining these internal constant environment within my tissue fluid or within my blood plasma, so this is the homeostasis with us. And if I were to quickly recall that what do we mean by the blood plasma or the tissue fluid, it's, you see that we have to be thinking in context of the distribution of the blood vessels. And in the blood vessels, you see I have got this artery coming. Then here we have the arterioles, and moving onward, we have got these blood capillaries, and there would be these venules with us. And at the end, the blood would be going away from an organ with the help of these veins that we have got. Now, within the blood plasma has got the glucose and the amino acid and the minerals and the vitamins and the antibodies and the stuff like that. So you see that these tissues that I have with me, so they are not lying in close association with the blood capillaries, but rather than they are lying a bit far from them. So that means that if I am considering these tissues, so they are lying in this external space out away from the blood capillaries, and this is the extracellular space. So if I have to be making sure that these tissues would get an adequate amount of the vitamins and the minerals and the stuff like that. So from the blood capillaries arteriolar end, the blood plasma has to seep out it when it would come into the extracellular space. So here we are making the tissue fluid with us. So whenever in this blood plasma and the tissue fluid, when we try to be regulating the condition of the temperature and the water and the stuff like that, so this would be the homeostasis with us. And if I were to name the important conditions that we have to regulate with the homeostasis, so among them we have this temperature coming, the blood glucose level coming, the level of the water I have to regulate, and then the amount of the waste materials we are required to be regulating. Now the situation is that how come each of the factors or the condition that I have named at the moment, so they impact our body. So if we were to talk about the temperature, we know that in a human body we have got enzymes, and these enzymes they catalyze the enzymatic reaction, and the temperature would have a direct impact on these enzymatic reactions. And if the temperature was going above the set limit of 38 degrees centigrade, so as a result of that, the enzymes would become denatured. And at the same time, if the temperature is getting low or is falling below 38 degrees centigrade, so as a consequence of that, the enzymes that we have with us, so they would slow down. Neither the denaturation of the enzymes I can afford, nor the enzymatic reactions getting slowed down I can afford. So this means that the temperature we are required to be regulating. Now, if I were to talk about the water impact, and you know that water is such an important solvent that it allows the hydrolytic reactions to be carried on in our body, and it would act as a solvent for the nutrients, the food nutrients that keep on flowing in our blood plasma from one part of the body to another part of the body. So this water is very important. But the thing is, like if I ever had I have these tissues with me. And outside of the tissues, now here you see that if I have this tissue fluid, and in the tissue fluid, if the amount of the water is increasing, then the water would enter into the tissues more. And as a result of that, the tissues would start bursting. Likewise, if in the external tissue fluid that we have here, and in here, if the water level is decreasing, then automatically in my tissues, the water level would increase and the water would start exiting the cells, and as a consequence of that, my cells would start to shrink. So this is something I don't want. So the water level has to be regulated. Now, moving onward, there is this blood glucose level that we have to be bothering about. The issue with the glucose is that this is highly soluble and it can have a very direct influence on the movement of the water. Like if I were to talk about outside of my cells that I have here. So if the glucose level is increasing in the tissue fluid, so this would lower the water level, and by that the water would exit the cells, and these cells they would start to shrink. Likewise, if outside of my cells, if the glucose is decreasing, then the water level would automatically increase, and by that the water would start to enter inside the cells, and these cells they would start bursting. So again, this is something I don't want. So by homeostasis, I'm required to be regulating the blood glucose level as well. Now, here the scenario is that how come this homeostasis would work in our body? So the answer is that the homeostatic control, this simply works by a mechanism or by a feedback mechanism, and that is entitled as the negative feedback mechanism. Now, the thing that you have to be keeping in your mind for the while is that my body would keep the temperature and the water and the conditions at a set point. And whenever the conditions they would change from the set point, like they can rise either or they can fall either. Like my body will try to keep the core body temperature at 38 degrees centigrade, but due to some reason or the other, my body temperature can rise and it can also fall. So what the negative feedback would do that if something is rising above the set limits, it would try to reduce it. And if something is falling below the set limit, then the negative feedback back mechanism would intend to raise it. So here you see that our body is doing the opposite of the change. If something is rising, the homeostasis by the negative feedback mechanism would lower it, and if something is falling, the negative feedback mechanism it would try to raise it. Now, if so, here we have to be understanding is that how come this negative feedback mechanism actually works. So, what we see here is that initially there would be a change in the environment, in the internal environment, and that would be the stimulus. And this stimulus, it would be detected by the receptors, and from there, the information would be brought toward the control centers, in which we have the brain and the spinal cord, and they would be deciding the response, or they would be deciding the corrective mechanism. And from here, the information would be carried toward the effectors of my body, that includes the muscles and the glands, and they would be compelled in such a way that these effectors would do the opposite of any of the change we were exposed to. Okay, like if I were to be saying this, like there is this condition of this temperature, and this condition of the temperature it got increased in the set level, so this would be a stimulus with me, and this would be detected by the receptors, and from here it would be carried to the control centers, and from there when the information would come to the effector, so the corrective mechanism would be activated, and the condition would return to the set point. Now, since we had got an increase in temperature, so the decrease in temperature would be brought about by at the end of the homeostatic control by the negative feedback mechanism. And after we have lowered the temperature comparative to this, now the corrective mechanism would be switched off. So I hope you would be clear with the idea of the homeostasis and how the homeostasis it works by the negative feedback mechanism.